When I first met Sarah, she was a breath of fresh air in my predictable life. We met in a little coffee shop just outside of Denver, the kind of place where the air smells of roasted beans and old wood. She wasn't like anyone I'd ever met before. Confident, magnetic, with an easy smile that seemed to promise endless adventures. I was drawn to her like gravity. Our relationship moved fast. Within months, I was sure she was the one. Sarah had this way of making life feel larger than it was, more vivid. Her spontaneity balanced my careful planning. She laughed at my dry jokes, and her presence felt like the antidote to the loneliness I hadn't realized had been growing in me. When Christmas approached, Sarah suggested we celebrate New Year's Eve somewhere special. "Let's rent a cabin in the Rockies," she said, her green eyes sparkling. "Bring your friends. It'll be unforgettable." Her enthusiasm was infectious, and I couldn't say no. I gathered my closest friends. Alex, the easygoing one. Tom, always full of stories. And Eric, the quiet thinker of the group. We'd been through everything together, from college pranks to heartbreaks. They were my brothers in every way but blood. As the date of the trip approached, I found myself excited and anxious. A part of me hoped this trip would seal the bond between Sarah and my friends, confirming that she truly belonged in my life. Another part of me, a quieter, nagging voice, wondered why I needed this kind of validation in the first place. Little did I know, that trip would become the darkest chapter of my life. The day we set off, the world outside was wrapped in snow. Driving through the Rockies felt like entering another realm, where time slowed and the air seemed sharper, cleaner. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, her playlist filling the car with upbeat songs that didn't quite match the heavy clouds overhead. In the back seat, Alex and Tom joked about who would drink the most on New Year's Eve, while Eric quietly scrolled through his phone, offering the occasional smirk. It felt good to have everyone together, even though I couldn't shake a strange tension in the pit of my stomach. Sarah leaned over, brushing her fingers against my arm. "This is going to be perfect," she said, her voice soft enough that only I could hear. I smiled, but her words felt like a dare. The cabin appeared out of nowhere, a lone structure tucked deep in the woods, its slanted roof heavy with snow. The isolation was striking. A single dirt road led us there, winding through a forest of towering evergreens. When we arrived, we were greeted by silence, broken only by the crunch of boots on snow. "Wow," Tom said, whistling low. "This is something else." The cabin was quaint but sturdy, with a wraparound porch and a small shed out back for firewood. Inside, it was warm, the kind of warm that smelled of pine and old stone. The living room was centered around a fireplace, the hearth stacked with neatly cut logs. A narrow staircase led to the bedrooms upstairs. We unpacked quickly, the air buzzing with excitement. Sarah took charge of assigning rooms, and her laughter echoed through the cabin as she teased Alex about snoring. At first, it seemed harmless, but I noticed how her laughter lingered, how her gaze held just a second too long. That night, we gathered around the fireplace, a bottle of whiskey making its rounds. Sarah was in the center of it all, leaning into conversations, her hand brushing against Tom's arm, then Alex's. I told myself it was nothing. She was naturally charismatic, the kind of person who drew people in. But when Eric caught my eye, his expression unreadable, I knew I wasn't imagining it. "Hey," I said, interrupting whatever joke she was telling. "Why don't we get some air?" Sarah blinked at me, surprised, but she agreed. Outside, the cold was biting, and the stars hung low, sharp and unforgiving. "What's up?" she asked, her breath visible in the icy air. "Just maybe tone it down a bit," I said carefully. She frowned, her playful demeanor hardening. "Tone what down?" "The flirting," I said, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. She laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. "You're imagining things, Mike. Come on, you know me better than that." I nodded, though her laughter left a bruise I couldn't name. When we returned inside, I felt a shift. The warmth of the fire felt suffocating, the walls of the cabin pressing closer. Something was wrong, though I couldn't yet put my finger on what. The following morning, I woke to the sound of laughter drifting up the staircase. It was Sarah's laugh, bright and unrestrained. But there was something in it that made my skin prickle. I pulled on a sweater and headed downstairs, where I found her sitting at the kitchen table with Alex and Tom. They were playing cards, mugs of steaming coffee in front of them, and her hand rested casually on Alex's shoulder. "Morning," I said, my voice cutting through their conversation. "Morning, sleepyhead." Sarah beamed at me, her tone too cheerful. "You missed all the fun. We already had a snowball fight." I forced a smile, but my gut twisted. She didn't even look guilty. Eric was at the counter, pouring himself a cup of coffee. He glanced at me, his expression carefully neutral. "We saved you some breakfast," he said, gesturing to a plate of scrambled eggs and toast. "Thanks," I muttered, taking the plate and sitting down across from Sarah. I tried to focus on eating, but my appetite had vanished. Every move she made seemed calculated to draw attention. The way she leaned closer to Alex to whisper something, the way her laughter rose just a little too loud. It was subtle, but it wasn't subtle enough. After breakfast, we decided to split into groups for a hike. Sarah immediately volunteered to go with Alex and Tom, leaving me and Eric to trudge through the woods alone. As we walked, the crunch of snow underfoot the only sound, Eric finally spoke. "You okay?" I shrugged, not trusting myself to answer. "I've known you a long time, Mike," he said, his tone cautious. "And I've never seen you this quiet." "It's nothing," I lied. Eric stopped walking and turned to face me. "Look, I don't want to stir up trouble, but Sarah's acting different." The words hit me like a punch. Hearing someone else say it made it real in a way I wasn't ready for. "You think I don't see that?" I snapped, the frustration boiling over. Eric raised his hands in a placating gesture. "I'm just saying, keep your eyes open. This trip's supposed to be fun, not whatever this is turning into." I nodded, though his words did little to calm me. That evening, the tension in the cabin was palpable. Sarah's behavior hadn't changed. If anything, it had become more blatant. She leaned into Tom while we played cards, her hand brushing his as she reached for the deck. Alex didn't seem to notice, or maybe he didn't care, but I could feel Eric's gaze on me, silently asking if I was going to do something. When Sarah caught my eye, her smile was small and almost teasing, as if daring me to call her out. By the time we turned in for the night, my nerves were frayed. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Sarah beside me, already asleep. Her breathing was steady, peaceful, as if she hadn't turned my world upside down in just 48 hours. I wanted to believe Eric was wrong, that I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew better. And the worst part? The weekend had barely begun. The next morning, I woke up early, unable to shake the weight pressing on my chest. Sarah was still asleep, her hair a tangled mess on the pillow. I stared at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that things would be okay, that maybe I was imagining it all, that I was overreacting. But when I walked downstairs, the sight that greeted me made my stomach drop. Sarah was in the kitchen, her back to me, laughing at something Alex said. He was standing close, too close, and the casual way she tilted her head toward him, her hand lightly brushing his arm, was anything but innocent. They didn't notice me at first, and for a moment I just stood there, frozen. Then Sarah turned, her smile faltering slightly when she saw me. "Morning, Mike," Alex said, his tone easy, as if nothing was wrong. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "Hey, babe," Sarah said, her voice overly sweet. "We were just talking about the hike later. You coming with us this time?" "Maybe," I said, my tone clipped. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't press the issue. Instead, she turned back to Alex, and their conversation continued as if I wasn't even there. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I spent most of it outside, chopping wood and clearing snow from the porch. The physical labor helped take the edge off, but it didn't stop my thoughts from spiraling. By late afternoon, I was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. I came inside to find Sarah and the others lounging in the living room, the fire crackling in the hearth. She was sitting between Tom and Alex, her legs tucked under her, a blanket draped over her shoulders. "Hey, you okay?" Eric asked, his voice low as he joined me in the kitchen. Yeah, I lied, though the tightness in my chest said otherwise. You don't look okay, he said, his tone careful. I glanced at him, debating whether to say what I'd been thinking all day. Do you think she's doing this on purpose? Eric hesitated, then nodded. It's crossed my mind. The confirmation hit harder than I expected. I wanted him to tell me I was being paranoid, that everything was fine. But deep down I knew he was right. That night, as the others drank and played games, I sat by the fire, watching Sarah. She was the center of attention, her laughter filling the room, her every movement drawing the others in. At one point, she caught my eye and smiled, as if to say, "See? Everything's fine." But it wasn't fine. It was far from fine. When the games ended and everyone started heading to bed, I lingered by the fire, unable to sleep. The silence of the cabin felt heavy, suffocating. Upstairs, I could hear the others settling in, their laughter fading into the creak of floorboards and the occasional muffled word. I finally went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. I lay there, staring at the dark ceiling, listening to the wind howling outside. Beside me, Sarah shifted in her sleep, her breathing steady and calm. I wanted to wake her, to ask her what the hell was going on, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I lay there, the storm outside mirroring the one brewing inside me, and I had no idea just how much worse it was about to get. The morning came with a heavy snowfall that blanketed the world outside in an eerie stillness. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was anything but peaceful. I hadn't spoken much to Sarah the night before, and she seemed to notice. Her attempts at conversation were light, but her eyes searched mine as if trying to gauge what I was thinking. The group decided to split up for the day again. Sarah volunteered to help with clearing snow around the cabin with Alex and Tom. The offer felt like another calculated move, but I couldn't find the words to stop her without sounding paranoid. "I'll take care of the firewood," I muttered, heading outside. Eric joined me after a few minutes, carrying an axe over his shoulder. He didn't say much, just started chopping logs alongside me, the rhythmic thud of the axe filling the silence. "You're holding it in," he finally said, his voice quiet. I slammed the axe into a log with more force than necessary. What am I supposed to do? Accuse her in front of everyone? Maybe not, Eric said, pausing to wipe sweat from his brow. But pretending it's not happening isn't going to fix it either. His words lingered long after he went back inside. I stayed out there for hours, my hands numb from the cold, trying to figure out what to do. When I finally returned to the cabin, the mood inside was strange. Sarah was sitting by the fire, her cheeks flushed from the cold, laughing at something Tom had said. Alex sat nearby, a knowing smirk on his face. "Hey," Sarah said when she saw me, her voice warm but cautious. "You've been out there all day. Come sit with us." "I'm fine," I said, heading to the kitchen to pour myself a drink. She followed me, her footsteps soft on the wooden floor. "Mike, what's going on?" I turned to face her, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. She looked so sincere, her eyes wide with concern. But I couldn't shake the image of her laughing with Alex, leaning into him, her hand brushing his. "You really don't know?" I finally said, my voice low. Her expression shifted, the concern giving way to something sharper. "What are you trying to say?" "I'm saying that I see how you act around them," I said, my frustration spilling over. "Do you think I'm stupid?" She stared at me for a long moment, then laughed. A short, bitter sound. "You're being ridiculous, Mike. They're your friends." "Exactly," I said, my voice rising. "They're my friends, not yours." Her face hardened, and for the first time, I saw something cold in her eyes. "If you can't trust me, maybe this trip was a mistake." Before I could respond, she turned and walked back to the living room, leaving me standing there with a drink in my hand and anger boiling in my chest. That night, I didn't join the group for games or drinks. Instead, I sat in the kitchen, nursing my whiskey and staring at the frost-covered window. The laughter from the living room grated on my nerves, each sound like a dagger twisting deeper. Eventually, the cabin grew quiet as everyone headed to bed. I stayed up, staring at the fire until the embers died out. And that's when I heard it. A low, muffled sound coming from outside. It took me a moment to realize it was coming from the direction of the sauna. My heart sank. Grabbing a flashlight, I headed out into the snow, the cold biting at my skin. The closer I got to the sauna, the clearer the sounds became. Laughter, whispers, and something else. My stomach churned as I opened the door, and what I saw inside shattered me. The sauna was filled with a haze of steam, the heat slapping me in the face as I stepped inside. For a second, the fog made it hard to see clearly, but the sounds were unmistakable. Low murmurs, a mix of laughter and gasps. And then I saw them. Sarah was in the center, her hair damp and clinging to her face. Her body pressed too close to Alex, Tom, and even Eric. They were sprawled on the wooden benches, their faces flushed from the heat, their expressions far too familiar. For a moment, I froze, my mind refusing to accept what my eyes were seeing. "Mike!" Sarah's voice broke through the fog, sharp and panicked. She scrambled to her feet, clutching a towel around her. "This isn't what it looks like." The words were so cliché, so hollow, that I almost laughed. "Not what it looks like?" I said, my voice low, trembling with barely restrained anger. "Then what the hell is it, Sarah?" The others didn't say a word. Alex looked away, guilt etched across his face. Tom shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze, while Eric, the one person I thought I could trust, stared at me with an expression I couldn't read. I was drunk," Sarah stammered, stepping toward me. It didn't mean anything. Her excuses blurred into static in my mind. All I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. All I could feel was the weight of betrayal crushing my chest. "Don't," I said, holding up a hand to stop her. My voice was steady now, cold. "Just don't." I turned and walked out, the freezing air outside hitting me like a slap. My hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from the rage boiling inside me. Back in the cabin, I paced the living room, my thoughts a whirlwind. How could she do this? With my friends, no less. The people I'd trusted most in the world. Every laugh, every glance, every touch over the past few days replayed in my mind. Pieces of a puzzle I'd been too blind to put together. A part of me wanted to confront them all, to scream, to demand answers. But another part of me, darker, quieter, wanted something else. I glanced at the pile of firewood by the hearth, then at the stack of matches on the mantel. An idea began to form, one born of hurt and anger. When Sarah finally came back to the cabin, her face was pale, her movements tentative. "Mike, please," she said, her voice breaking. "Let me explain." I didn't answer. I didn't even look at her. Instead, I grabbed the matches and headed to the porch, where the rest of the firewood was stored. "What are you doing?" she asked, following me outside. I ignored her, piling the wood into the fire pit and lighting it. The flames roared to life, crackling and spitting as they consumed the logs. "Mike, stop!" she yelled, grabbing my arm. "We need that." I finally turned to her, my face a mask of calm. "Do we?" Her eyes widened as she realized what I was doing. "You can't just leave us here without heat." "Watch me," I said, my voice ice cold. Inside, I packed my things in silence. Sarah begged me to stay, her voice cracking with desperation, but I didn't waver. The others stayed upstairs, too ashamed or too afraid to come down. By the time I left, the fire in the pit had burned low, its embers glowing faintly in the dark. I didn't look back as I got into my car and drove away, the cabin disappearing behind me. The road was treacherous, the snow falling heavily, but I didn't care. All I could think about was putting as much distance as possible between me and the people who had betrayed me. The drive down the mountain was a blur. The snow came down harder, the flakes thick and relentless, as if the storm outside mirrored the one raging inside me. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, but I barely noticed. The cabin and its occupants, Sarah, Alex, Tom, even Eric, felt like a distant nightmare. I told myself I was done with them, that I could leave them behind without a second thought. But the truth was, their betrayal clung to me like the cold that seeped into the car. The wind howled as the tires struggled against the icy road. For a moment I considered turning back. Not for Sarah or the others, but because I knew how dangerous the storm was. Leaving them without heat, in the middle of nowhere, felt cruel. But then I thought of Sarah's face in the sauna, flushed and laughing, surrounded by my so-called friends. I thought of the excuses, the way she had begged for forgiveness without any real remorse. And I kept driving. I reached a small roadside diner just before midnight. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting a faint red glow onto the snow-covered parking lot. I parked the car and sat there for a long time, the engine idling, the heater humming softly. Inside, the diner was nearly empty. A waitress with tired eyes poured me a cup of coffee, and I sat at the counter, staring into the black liquid as if it held answers. I pulled out my phone and saw a flurry of missed calls and texts from Sarah. Her messages ranged from frantic apologies to angry accusations, each one a twisted attempt to reel me back in. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened my contacts and stared at Eric's name. He hadn't called or texted, which somehow felt worse than Sarah's desperate attempts. He'd been my closest friend, the one I thought I could rely on. And yet, he'd betrayed me just as much as she had. My thumb hovered over the delete button, but I couldn't bring myself to press it. Not yet. As the hours passed, the diner grew quieter, the hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound. I thought about what Eric had said earlier about keeping my eyes open. Had he been warning me, or was he just trying to ease his own guilt? I thought about Sarah, the way she had looked at me in the beginning, full of love and trust. Had it all been a lie? Or had something changed along the way, something I'd been too blind to see? The questions spiraled endlessly, each one cutting deeper than the last. By the time the storm began to ease, the coffee in my cup had gone cold, and my body ached from sitting for so long. I paid my bill and headed back to the car, the snow crunching under my boots. As I sat in the driver's seat, the silence of the night pressed down on me. I didn't know where I was going or what I would do next. All I knew was that I couldn't go back. Not to the cabin, not to Sarah, not to the life I thought I had. I started the engine, the headlights cutting through the darkness, and drove into the unknown. The open road stretched before me, endless and quiet, save for the faint hum of the car's engine. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a world cloaked in pristine white. The snow sparkled under the moonlight, beautiful and serene, so at odds with the chaos inside me. The cabin felt a lifetime away, but its ghosts lingered, whispering in the dark corners of my mind. I kept replaying the events in the sauna, searching for signs I might have missed. The laughter, the stolen glances, the subtle touches. All of it had been there, right in front of me. How had I let it get this far? I stopped at a gas station somewhere off the highway. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I filled the tank, the cold biting at my skin despite my thick jacket. Inside the convenience store, I grabbed a coffee and stared blankly at the rows of snacks and cigarettes, my thoughts spinning. The clerk, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, rang me up. "Late night drive?" she asked, her voice cutting through the haze. "Something like that," I replied, forcing a faint smile. She handed me the change and studied me for a moment. "Whatever it is, kid, it'll pass. Storms always do." I nodded, though her words felt hollow. Not every storm leaves things intact when it's over. Back on the road, the darkness felt heavier. The snowbanks on either side of the highway rose like walls, trapping me in with my thoughts. I couldn't shake the image of Sarah's face as she begged me to stay. Her tears had seemed real, but were they born of guilt or fear? And Eric, what had he been thinking? Was it all a game to him? Or had he been caught up in something he couldn't control? The anger that had burned so fiercely earlier was now a dull ache, replaced by something harder to define. Betrayal, yes, but also self-loathing. How had I been so blind, so foolish? I thought about all the times I'd ignored the little red flags. The way Sarah had flirted with strangers when we were out. Her tendency to turn things around when I confronted her. I'd brushed it off, told myself it wasn't a big deal. But it was. By the time the sun began to rise, casting a pale pink glow over the horizon, I found myself pulling into the parking lot of a cheap motel. My body ached with exhaustion, but my mind refused to quiet. The room was small and smelled faintly of bleach, but it was warm and the bed was clean. I sank onto the mattress, staring at the ceiling as the events of the past few days swirled in my mind. I picked up my phone and scrolled through the unread messages. Sarah had sent another string of texts. "Mike, please, just come back. We can fix this. It was a mistake, I swear. I love you. Don't do this to us." Each word felt like a knife twisting deeper. I wanted to reply, to scream at her, to demand answers. But what was the point? No explanation could undo what had happened. I tossed the phone onto the nightstand and closed my eyes, willing sleep to come. But as the hours dragged on, the only thing that came was the gnawing question. What did I do to deserve this? The motel room was a refuge in the silence, a place where I could hide from the storm both outside and within. But no matter how long I lay there, no matter how many times I turned my phone off and back on again, I couldn't escape the thoughts that haunted me. The betrayal, the lies, the way Sarah had looked at me with false innocence. All of it stuck to me like a thick, suffocating fog. I hadn't realized how much I had been suppressing until it all came crashing down. The arguments that we'd never fully resolved. The tension that had been building for months. I thought I was in control, that I could keep things from falling apart. But it was clear now I wasn't in control. The next morning, I left the motel as quickly as I could. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay in one place for long. The open road felt like my only escape. I drove for hours, the landscape shifting from snow-covered mountains to barren plains, all the while my mind churning. I couldn't stop thinking about Sarah. I couldn't stop thinking about her touch, her laughter in the sauna. Every part of me wanted to hate her, wanted to walk away and never look back. But there was a part of me, a weak, foolish part, that still wanted to believe in her, to believe that what we had wasn't just a lie. By the time I reached a small town hours away from where I had left the cabin, I felt empty. I parked the car outside a quiet cafe, the smell of fresh coffee and baked goods drifting through the air. It should have been comforting, but all I could feel was the ache in my chest. I went inside, took a seat by the window, and ordered a coffee. The warmth of the drink felt like a contradiction, a temporary reprieve from the cold reality I was facing. I sipped slowly, staring out at the street, lost in thought. And then my phone buzzed. It was a message from Sarah. "Mike, I'm coming to find you. Please, let's talk." I stared at the message, my stomach tightening. I didn't know whether to be angry or relieved. I didn't know if I should be scared or hopeful. I didn't know anything anymore. After a long moment, I typed a response. "It's too late, Sarah. You made your choice." The message was sent before I could second-guess myself. I waited for a reply, but none came. My heart pounded in my chest, the weight of what I had just written settling over me like a thick fog. The finality of it hit me harder than I expected. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was making a huge mistake. I spent the next few hours wandering the town, walking aimlessly through the streets. I didn't know what I was searching for. Answers, closure, redemption, but everything felt empty, like I was just moving through the motions. As night fell, I found myself standing outside a bar, staring at the neon sign flickering in the window. I wasn't thirsty. I wasn't looking for company. I just needed to be somewhere other than inside my own head. When I walked in, the atmosphere was warm, the hum of quiet conversation filling the air. I made my way to the bar and ordered a drink, then took a seat at one of the stools, trying to ignore the ache in my chest. I had no idea how long I'd been sitting there when the door opened and a figure stepped inside. The silhouette was familiar, and I knew instantly who it was. Sarah. She stood in the doorway, her eyes scanning the room, before they landed on me. For a moment, she just stared, her expression unreadable. Then she took a hesitant step forward, her heels clicking softly against the floor. "Mike," she said, her voice shaky. "Please, we need to talk." I didn't respond immediately. Couldn't. The anger and hurt were too fresh, too raw. But as she walked closer, I saw the desperation in her eyes, the same eyes that had once held nothing but affection and trust. She stopped in front of me, her hands shaking as she reached out. Please, don't hate me. I recoiled slightly, instinctively pulling away. I didn't want her touch. I didn't want her anything. Not after what I had seen, not after what she had done. But Sarah wasn't backing down. Mike, I made a mistake. I was confused. I wasn't thinking. No, I said, my voice tight with emotion. You weren't confused. You knew exactly what you were doing. Her face faltered, her lips trembling as if she was about to cry. I never meant to hurt you. I love you. I do. The words hit me like a slap, sharp and painful. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to reach out and say that everything could be fixed, that we could somehow go back to the way things were. But the truth was, I didn't know if I could ever look at her the same way again. You don't get it, do you? I said, my voice breaking. You don't get how much you've hurt me. She fell silent, her gaze dropping to the floor as the weight of my words settled between us. I didn't know what would come next. I didn't know what I was supposed to do, or if anything could ever fix this. All I knew was that the past few days had shattered something in me, something that might never be repaired. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. Sarah stood there, her face pale, her hands still trembling. I could see the regret in her eyes, but I couldn't tell if it was truly for what she had done or simply because she had been caught. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to make her understand the depth of the betrayal. But I couldn't find the words. Instead, I just sat there, staring at her, my chest tight with 1,000 emotions I couldn't unravel. Mike, please. Her voice cracked as she took a step closer, but I didn't move. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you, but I love you, I do. I'm sorry. The words stung, but not in the way they used to. They felt hollow, empty, like an apology she was saying because she had to, not because she truly understood the damage she had caused. You don't get it, Sarah? I said quietly, my voice hoarse. I don't even know who you are anymore. Her eyes filled with tears, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. The truth had already hit me. No matter how much she apologized, how many tears she shed, the fact remained. Everything had changed. I'm not the same person I was when I walked into that cabin, I continued, my voice shaking with the weight of it all. I've been looking at you, at all of you, through a lens that was cracked. And now I can't look at any of you the same way again. There was a long pause, the words hanging in the air like a sentence, as if I had sealed the fate of what we could have been. I understand, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't deserve your forgiveness. I never meant for it to end like this. But please, don't give up on me. Don't give up on us. I closed my eyes for a moment, the weight of the decision pressing on my chest. I loved her once, deeply, and part of me wanted to believe that love was enough to overcome the betrayal. But another part of me, the part that had been broken, shattered in a way I couldn't explain, knew that there was no going back. You've already given up on us, I said, finally looking up at her. You gave up the moment you decided to do what you did, and I can't be part of that anymore. Her face twisted with pain, and I saw something break in her eyes. For a moment, it felt like I was tearing apart her world, but the truth was, I was trying to save myself. I'll go, she whispered, stepping back. I'll go. But I'm sorry, Mike. I'm so sorry. As she turned and walked away, I couldn't bring myself to watch her go. Instead, I sat there, frozen in place, the weight of the decision settling deep within me. There would be no turning back from this, no undoing what had been done. The days after Sarah left were a blur. I stayed in the small town for a while, not knowing where else to go, not knowing what to do. I couldn't go back to the cabin, not with the memories of betrayal still fresh in my mind. I thought about Sarah constantly. I thought about what we had, what we could have been. But the truth was, I didn't know if I could ever trust her again. The love I had for her had been poisoned by lies and deception, and no amount of apologies could change that. The phone calls came, sometimes from Sarah, sometimes from Alex, Tom, or Eric, but I didn't pick up. Couldn't. I didn't have the strength to face any of them, not when I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. I had to let go. One evening, as I sat in a diner sipping my coffee, I thought back to the past few weeks. The trip to the cabin, the coldness of the mountain air, the warmth that had once existed between us. It all felt like a lifetime ago. But one thing had become clear to me. I had to rebuild. I had to find a way to move on from the pain and betrayal. I wasn't sure how or even if I could, but I knew I couldn't stay stuck in the past forever. I reached for my phone, stared at it for a moment, and then, without thinking, deleted the last text Sarah had sent me. It was too late. As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, I found myself driving once again, the road stretching before me like an endless opportunity. Maybe it was time to face forward. Maybe it was time to find a new path. But I couldn't deny the fact that the journey had changed me, and I wasn't sure who I was anymore. This story has been a hard one to tell, and even harder to live through. Sometimes, the people we trust the most can hurt us in ways we never expected. The pain of betrayal is something that stays with you, and it's not always easy to move on. But in the end, we have to make a choice, whether to stay trapped in the past or find a way to heal and move forward. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? Could you ever forgive someone who broke your trust? Or would you walk away? I'm genuinely curious to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let's talk about it. And if you want to hear more stories like this, make sure to subscribe. There's plenty more to come.